Hello, I'm Roger Watson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education and Practice, and in this session I want to talk about enhancing the quality of health research. Now, there are some general things to say about enhancing the quality of health research and some very specific things that I can say about it. Generally speaking, the whole publishing process of having academic journals with editors and having papers peer-reviewed and finally edited and looked at by a team of editors, then subsequently produced and published by the journal according to certain standards. This is all part of enhancing the quality. Without some oversight and some view on the work that's published, we feel that the work may not be of a appropriate standard for publication. So the whole publication process that I've already spoken about in a previous video is to a large extent about enhancing the quality. At least we hope that it's doing that. But balanced against that, of course, there's also the movement to try and get results available as quickly as possible. So these days we allow pre-printing. Papers are pre-printed before they go to a journal. Most leading publishers will accept pre-printing. They don't see it as plagiarism, provided the preprint is available online and declared in the paper. To some extent, that's also to do with enhancing the quality, because the preprints, quite separate from being submitted to a journal for review and publication and editing, the preprints will not be reviewed, will not be edited. They may well have mistakes in them or errors, but people can comment on them, and people frequently do. So if you preprint a paper on a pre-printing site, and a common one that's used by nurses is medRxiv, it's free to use. It's run by the British Medical Journal, the Cold Harbour Spring Laboratory, and I think the Journal of American Medical Association. I think it's those journals that run it, and it's free to use. So you can preprint your papers, and if you go in, people will make comments on them, and you can take those comments into account either in revising your paper before you submit it to a journal, or when you are revising it for a journal. So the pre-printing process, which is actually very new, or at least the widespread nature of it's very, very new, certainly in nursing and medicine, is considered now to be part of the quality process. It's also to do with making results available much more quickly. So the whole publishing process, including pre-printing, peer review and editing, that's to do with enhancing quality. However, there's more to it than that, particularly within health research. And the Equator network is what I want to point you to in this regard. The Equator network, which is about enhancing the quality of published research, that's its mission, is a website which gathers together all of the approved standards for publishing academic papers. And these are very, very useful. And again, all leading journals, all leading publishers will point you towards the Equator guidelines. They may be very specific or they may be general. For example, if you're publishing a randomized controlled trial, they will ask you to use the specific Equator guidance for those, likewise for a systematic review. Otherwise, for other kinds of papers, they may say, please find the appropriate Equator guidance to use in presenting your paper. And these are very much about quality, because they're standardized way of checking off and presenting papers, and they give you a clear indication of what should be reported within the paper. So I can do no better thing really than point you towards the Equator network. At one time there were a handful of guidelines in there. I can remember when there were about 8 or 10 sets of guidelines in there. I'm sorry I can't tell you how many there are now. I know there are a great many more. I think there are dozens of different sets of guidance now, and subsets of different kinds of guidance. So what does the Equator network contain? Well, the first, I'm going to refer to two different types of ways of presenting papers which are contained within the Equator network. These are the most common, but there are other Equator guidelines available. Before Equator was formed, the first set of guidance for presenting papers that was derived, and it's only around 20 years old, was the consort set of guidelines. This is the consolidated guidance for presenting randomized controlled trials. And I can't imagine that anyone listening to this, even if they're not a writer, certainly if you read academic papers, I would find it unusual if you didn't know what the consort guidance was, or at least if I showed it to you, and it'll be in the PowerPoint presentations, you'll recognize it because you see it used in papers. And this was the first set of guidance derived by Moher and colleagues. And in fact, David Moher from Canada, has been responsible for a great many more, great many other parts of the guidance within Equator. If you look at the papers, you'll find his name there. So the point behind the consort guidance was really to tackle the poor quality of reporting of randomized controlled trials. And there are two aspects to the consort guidance. One is a checklist of around 25 items or something like that, and also a flow diagram. There are other aspects to it as well, but that's the main thing. You can find the original consort guidance there. It was franchised across a great many different syndicated, across many journals, originally published in the BMJ, but you'll find it elsewhere. It's presented there, so you can actually read and find out what the consort guidance is about. But the important thing for you, if you're presenting any kind of experimental work where there are two groups, a comparison group with a treatment group, a control group, or however you've divided up your groups, you may have several different groups, you may have 3 or 4 arms to a trial. It must be reported according to the consort guidance. All quality journals will insist that you do that. So these quality journals want to see the checklist submitted with the paper, and the checklist is very, very useful because actually it's how to write a paper. It tells you about title, abstract, structuring the abstract, which we've talked about already, introduction, what should be in the background, what should be in the methods, and so forth. Very useful, and you should be able to tick off all of these, and if you can't tick something off, it's not fatal, but you should be able to explain why you haven't done that particular aspect of the study. But it's very detailed. It will ask you to explain how you've ensured that there's no bias, how you randomized, very detailed indeed. So the journal, if your paper is described as a randomized control trial of something, they will expect to see the consort checklist submitted along with the paper for the reviewers to look at, and for that to be kept alongside the files of the journal, files of the article. The checklist won't be published, but what they will publish and also expect to see is the consort flow diagram, which shows you all the potential patients that could have been in your trial. So you'll be familiar with these boxes that you get in the consort flow diagram. All the potential patients that you could have included in your trial, the sample that you actually included in your trial, the numbers that were allocated to the different arms of the study, and the number that survived at the end, and the number which you actually analysed, so that you can do what's called intention to treat analysis. It should all add up from the bottom to the top to the same number. That's a common mistake, and make sure it adds up. So they want to see that. They want every single patient who was entered into the trial to be accounted for in the consort flow diagram. So that's one of the ways of enhancing the quality of research. It's the consort flow diagram. And one very important part of the consort flow diagram, and I'm sort of stopping on this for quite a long time because it's very important, is they will ask you near the end of the checklist, where is the study registered? And I've mentioned this before. If you're doing a randomized controlled trial or any kind of study with human participants where people are divided into groups for treatment and comparison, you have to register that on a registration site, and it will not be published without it. And registration sites are available in all the major continents of the world, and there's a Chinese trial registration site. It's available in Chinese and in English. So you must register the trial. You will not get away without doing that. You cannot do it retrospectively. It has to be registered when the paper comes to the journal. It should really have been registered before the study even started. So that's again part of the quality enhancement, because it allows people to check the protocol and to see what you said you were going to do and to see if you actually did it. It also helps people to chase up authors to make sure that they have actually published the paper and aren't hiding, for example, poor results in a clinical trial. They should all eventually be published. So, as I said, I only want to talk about two aspects of the Equator guidance. The second aspect is the second set of guidance is the PRISMA guidance, and these are the preferred reporting method of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And I don't want to say too much about these. They were the second set of guidance to be derived, and when CONSORT and PRISMA were derived, Equator didn't exist. Equator came along later to gather all these together. The PRISMA set of guidance for systematic reviews and meta-analysis will also be required by all high-quality journals and publishers if you're doing a systematic review. And to some extent, they are remarkably similar, although they serve a different purpose, to the CONSORT guidance. You will find a checklist of roughly 25 items, and you will also find a flow diagram, and I'm sure all of you who've read systematic reviews will be familiar with that flow diagram. And that flow diagram does a similar thing to the CONSORT guidance. It shows you all the papers that you found in your initial search, and then the ones that you've put into the analysis, having filtered out on the basis of maybe the title was the wrong paper, or on the abstract, and the ones that you finally included in your systematic review. So it serves a very similar purpose. And do make sure that you use the most recent version of the PRISMA flowchart, because it has changed recently and they require a lot more detail now than they did before. So it serves exactly the same purpose as the CONSORT. It helps you to account for every paper, and you have to make sure it adds up from the top, from the bottom up to the top. Again, common mistake is that it doesn't add up. So, and the checklist they expect to see too. The checklist for the PRISMA guidance doesn't ask you to register systematic reviews, but clinical systematic reviews can be registered these days. There's a site called Prospero where you can register them. It's not yet compulsory, but it is advised. So, CONSORT and PRISMA, really quite similar, serving different purposes. There are lots of extensions on both of them. For example, on PRISMA, there are extensions for doing systematic reviews into alternative medicines and traditional Chinese medicines, for example. So there are some very specific sets of guidance there. So do make sure that not only you use PRISMA, if you're doing a systematic review, find the specific set of guidance for the specific kind of study that you're doing. Very, very useful indeed, and they're constantly updated. So do go to the Equator site and find the latest guidance. So other than that, there are other sets of guidance within Equator. There's guidance there for doing qualitative studies. There's guidance there for mixed method studies. There's guidance for case control studies. Almost any kind of study that you can think of, almost any kind of design you can think of, there will be a set of guidance suitable for that study. And it's all to do with enhancing quality, particularly the quality of the reporting of health research, to make sure that there's a certain conformity across these studies to the highest possible standards. So just to recap, the publishing process itself is concerned with enhancing the quality of health research. That's what we're trying to do. Of course, we don't always achieve that, but we do our best. Within that, the Equator guidance is probably the major plank of ensuring quality in health research. And the Equator set of guidance, primarily the CONSORT guidance and the PRISMA guidance, but there are other sets of guidance, provide authors with standardized ways of presenting their studies, and it enhances the review process because reviewers can look for particular bits of information to make sure that they're there, and they can also check to see that they're done appropriately. And in line with that, specific to randomised controlled trials, the registration of trials is absolutely essential and very much part of the enhancing the quality of clinical research in particular. So that's everything I want to say about enhancing the quality of clinical research. If we had longer, I'm sure I could say more. I hope that was sufficient and helpful, and thank you very much for listening.